words of Paul to the church at Corinth. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. Brothers and sisters, do not be children in your thinking. Rather, be infants in evil, but in thinking, be adults. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of this holy word this day. Thanks be to God.
Paul's word to the church in Corinth could be summarized in 2 words. Anybody have an idea what those two words would be? The choir knows. Grow up. Grow up. That's what Paul is saying. Grow up. We all understand the concept of growth when it comes to our physical development. We all know why that's important. We can't all stay baby size forever, right? Babies are born physically and mentally immature. And we expect them to grow and to develop as they age. And if they don't do that, then there's a problem. Well, understanding spiritual growth is a similar concept. And I hope to share that with you as I continue this morning so that we come to understand how our growth in spiritual things is important and that we need to grow spiritually mature in our faith. When we first become aware that we're children of God, we are what I would call spiritually immature. And as time passes, we begin hopefully to develop qualities and abilities that the Bible says characterize those that are mature in their faith. And there are lots of scriptures, especially in the New Testament, that describe what you need to do to grow and mature spiritually. And you can find them in letters written in Ephesians, you can find them in 2 Peter, in 2 Thessalonians, and in writings to the Philippians, just as in the scripture that was read this morning to the church in Corinth. So if we don't grow spiritually, we might not think of it this way, but it's just as bad as if we don't grow physically. When we don't grow spiritually, there's a problem. So just as we have to do certain things to grow physically, there's certain things that we need to do to grow in our faith, to grow spiritually. And so the letter in our something that God has given us to do is maturity, and that stands for spiritual maturity. So the first thing that we need to do if we want to grow in our spiritual maturity is that we have to have a desire to grow. That's the first, probably most important thing. We have to have a desire to grow. You had that desire to grow when you were a kid. Maybe you remember these words that you would speak. Maybe you spoke them often. When I grow up, I'm going to what? Do things differently. I'm going to do this, do that. We all wanted to be able to be older than we were because there were always things that we wanted to do that our parents would tell us, you can't do those until you grow up. Well, I think it's the same thing for our spiritual growth. We should be as excited in our spiritual growth as we are when we watch children grow. You know how exciting it is when a child takes their first steps, learns their first words, drives their first car, whatever it is that is the first. We take pictures of it. We post them everywhere. We have albums full of firsts, right? Everyone wants their child to grow and mature and develop new abilities. And parents use all sorts of enticements to encourage their kids to develop and to grow, right? Well, it should be the same way in our spiritual matters. We should want to grow as much spiritually as we do physically. And so we start out as spiritual babies, you could say. And sometimes it's easy to be spiritually immature, and maybe some people like to be spiritually immature. That way you don't have any responsibilities, right? It's kind of like when you're a kid. you don't have a lot of responsibilities. Well, being spiritually immature might seem to be something that you might desire because you don't have to do much if you're spiritually immature, because others will teach you, others will feed you, others will take care of your spiritual needs. But we're all born so that we can grow up. None of us get to stay children, and none of us should want to stay children in our spiritual lives either. Because part of our spiritual growth and maturity means that we're going to be looking at ways that as we mature, that then we put our faith into action and we serve God. I think sometimes in the beginning of our faith, we have a lot of enthusiasm for growing spiritually. And we get excited when we discover new things that we can do that lead us to a more healthy spiritual life. But somewhere along the way, we lose our enthusiasm for spiritual development. We sometimes, I think, suffer from spiritual indifference. And there's words that I think go along with spiritual indifference sometimes. Been there, done that. I think sometimes that can let others know, as well as yourself, that maybe you're a little spiritually indifferent. The scriptures, though, teach us that spiritual growth is always needed. I guess this is the good news and the bad news. We never have a need to not grow spiritually. Spiritual maturity doesn't have a cutoff date. Okay? At least not while we're here on this earth. So you can never say that you're spiritually mature and that you don't need to do anything else for your spiritual health. Sorry, folks, that's how it goes.
Amen.
So if you've been around and been spiritual for a long time, you still got a ways to go. Being spiritually mature means that we need to have spiritual nourishment. Just as we can't grow from children into young adults into adulthood without proper nutrition, we cannot grow spiritually without proper nutrition. And we know that in order to grow physically, that we need to have regularly scheduled meals, at least we're supposed to have, that we need to eat food that's healthy for us, right? And that we need to be consistent with the things that we eat to nourish our bodies. And I think the same is true for our spiritual health. We cannot grow spiritually mature and healthy unless we have spiritual food. And our spiritual food is God's Word. So we have to be nourishing our spiritual selves as much as we nourish our physical selves. And I don't think we think about it that way. How do you nourish your spiritual growth? Do you spend as much time nourishing your spirit as you do nourishing your body? I would say that we probably don't. But our spiritual maturity and our spiritual health are just as important as healthy physical bodies. So we need to nourish our spirits. We also, if we're going to be more spiritually mature, we need to exercise and practice our faith. I talked last week about the athletes that were gifted to run. They knew they were gifted. They had that in them. But they also remember that they had to practice. That they couldn't just rely on that gift, that they had to practice. And it's the same way with our spiritual health and spiritual maturity. We have to practice spiritual life. We have to practice and practice and practice. Isn't that how you learn your multiplication tables? Over and over and over again. You had to say them until you could say them just like that. Or if you want to learn a new word, spelling words, I can remember in school writing those words 5 or 10 times. Because that's the way that you learn and retain things, is by doing it over and over and over again. And it's the same with our spiritual health. If we want to grow spiritually mature, we have to practice over and over again the things that are going to bring us spiritual health. So we need to read our scriptures regularly. We need to be praying regularly. We need to be practicing our faith regularly. And that means going out into the world and doing things for others. Of course, just like growing physically, it takes time. We don't grow overnight from babies to adults. It takes a span of time. Our spiritual growth also takes time. And I think sometimes we get as impatient to grow spiritually as we might have gotten impatient to grow up as young people. But we cannot reach any of our goals overnight, physical or spiritual. And we can become discouraged when we make mistakes along the way. How often does a child fall before they learn to walk? A lot. Well, as we grow spiritually, we're also going to have some backsteps, some failures, some things that don't go well, but we don't give up on our faith. We just keep after it until it's something that we can do without thinking. And the Bible gives us a lot of encouragement. You know, there's a lot of folks in the Bible that were, as they were becoming spiritually mature, you know, took some steps back and had to start over again. Maybe you remember Moses' story. I think he was pretty spiritually mature, but when God came and said, I want you to go back and set the people free, Moses said, no, can't do it. I don't talk good enough. I don't talk well enough. He didn't even use the right word. I don't talk so good. And then there was David, who coveted another's wife and saw another man killed so that he could have what he wanted. And still a man of God. Jonah, who was commissioned by God to go to Nineveh and tell the people to shape up, went in the opposite direction, but still faithful in the end to God. And Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, and Paul, who was a persecutor of Christians before he found Christ, and Thomas, who we know as the doubter. All of these great spiritual people, and yet they also took steps backwards at times in their lives and had to recover. But they never gave up. They never quit believing. Great Christians are not people who live without failure. That's not how it works. But people who move beyond their mistakes and go on to serve God and to do the work that God has called us to do that something that God has placed in each one of us. That's the true story and true merit that shows how we've grown spiritually more mature. There's a story of a little boy who fell out of bed, and when he was asked what happened, he said, I guess I just stayed too close to the getting in place. See, that's exactly what happens when we don't mature in our faith. We get to the beginning, or we get into the getting in place of our faith, and then we fall out, or we don't get any further into the bed. And so we stay there, and we don't mature. But if we want to accomplish the something that God has placed in us, then we have to be working at becoming more spiritually mature. And spiritual maturity is a great thing because it helps us see God differently, it helps us see ourselves differently, and it helps us see others differently. Spiritual maturity helps us develop a deeper sense of God and understand in a deeper way God's purpose for all of us. So spiritual maturity transforms us, changes us, puts us one step closer to doing that something that God has placed in all of us to do. And without spiritual maturity, we're not going to have a chance then to make a difference in the world, because we're not going to be able to see what God puts right in front of us to accomplish. So I want you to continue to think about this something that God is calling you to do or be. This something that even God is calling this church to be. And I want you to remember that it's going to take sacrifice, it's going to take obedience, it's going to take maturity, and it's going to take effort and encouragement to accomplish that something that God is placing in us and in this church to do to make a difference in the world. But as I said last week, and I'll say it again today, with Christ who is with us, with God who champions us, anything is possible. Anything.